This has been an amazing development over the weekend, particularly on yesterday. 5 Arab states cut off all diplomatic and economic ties with Qatar, a very small peninsular country bordering Saudi Arabia. These 5 nations are Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Bahrain, the UAE, United Arab Emirates, and Yemen. Both of these nations, or all 5 of these nations, have agreed to cut off economic and diplomatic ties with Qatar. This means now Qatar is landlocked in terms of any other access to Qatar must come through Saudi Arabia. And so now that these nations have cut off all ties with Qatar, all food shipments, all flights are prohibited through their normal transportation means, which means they are having to circumvent all of these nations in order to get flights in and out of their nation. And they're having to find other sources for simple supplies such as eggs, chicken, milk, the basic necessities of life. They are having to go to other nations. In fact, Saudi Arabia supplies 50% of the country's food supply. And so now that they are at odds with Saudi Arabia, 50% of their food supply must be made up through other means. Egypt has 250,000 people working in Qatar right now. They have ordered their citizens to leave the nation. Qatari citizens and diplomats were given 48 hours to leave. All of the 5 nations that we previously mentioned. Al Jazeera, which is a news outlet which is based in Qatar, traces the beginning of the crisis back to May 23rd. On May 23rd, Qatar was hacked and several, quote, according to Al Jazeera, quote, false statements were released, which were all attributed to the Emir of Qatar. CNN has reported that it was the Russians who actually implemented the hack and instituted the leak. This set off a cascading series of events which ultimately culminated with the severing of all diplomatic and economic ties with the small nation of Qatar. Now, before we go into any more of the details about the tensions that exist between Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and all the other nations, we have to bring up the fact that the President of the United States, Donald Trump, has added to the fuel of this escalation. In a series of tweets, Donald Trump identified Qatar as the source of terrorism, funding of terrorism in the Middle East. He said this in the context of his visit to Saudi Arabia. He credited Saudi Arabia with doing the right thing by cutting off ties with Qatar. Qatar, depends on who you speak with. The irony of this clearly is that amidst the United States offering a multi-billion-dollar arms deal to Saudi Arabia, and amidst the fact that Saudi Arabia is one of the leading funders and purveyors of terrorism, the ideology that drives much of the terrorism around the globe comes from Saudi Arabia. Donald Trump, I want to say as almost like a child, has taken the word of Saudi Arabia over and above Qatar. Now, this is not to absolve Qatar of any of their of their ties to terrorism in general, Hamas in specific, the Muslim Brotherhood in specific. This is not to absolve them of any of their relationships that are deemed problematic by the United States State Department and the CIA. This is not to absolve them, but this is definitely to say, what level of hypocrisy must we operate in to look at Saudi Arabia as someone who's going to do something actively against state-sponsored terrorism, against the big bad wolf of Qatar, when in actuality, the ideology that drives the preponderance of terrorism across the globe is Wahhabism. And its roots and its driving force, ideological driving force and funding comes from Saudi Arabia. Now, I said with hesitance whether or not this is something that is childlike naivete from the president, because I'm almost at the threshold where I cannot credit the imbecility of Donald Trump, of his decisions, simply to naivete. And what I mean by that is that at a certain threshold, we have to take a step back and say no one in this position of power who has access to this amount of information and who has this much money tied up across the globe personally can be this dumb. Because if we continue to just simply assert that Donald Trump is an idiot, then he has the perfect cover to do exactly what he wants to do without us imbuing nefarious connotations on his actions. In other words, at some point, we have to take a step back and say Donald Trump is not doing these things because he's an idiot. Donald Trump is doing these things because it is beneficial to his bottom line or his ideological agenda. My personal estimation is that Donald Trump is doing this because of his bottom line. But at this point, I can't rule out any possibility, because what does it take for the chief, the commander-in-chief of the United States military forces to undermine one of our largest bases in the region, so much so that the Pentagon had to state that they are not able to square their militaristic position with that of the President of the United States? All because Donald Trump wanted to state in a series of tweets that he is in favor of this severance of economic and diplomatic ties between Saudi Arabia, Yemen, the UAE, Egypt, and Bahrain from Qatar. Ultimately, I believe that, and not just a belief of mine, but just drawing from multiple sources, that this is really a question of regional hegemony. This is really a question of who's going to be the powerhouse in the region. Will it be Saudi Arabia or will it be Iran? Qatar has been a nation that has attempted to play both sides in this question. We know there's an ongoing feud, a proxy feud that's emblematic of the civil war that's going on in Yemen. There's been an ongoing feud between Saudi Arabia and Iran in terms of who's going to be the regional hegemon, who is going to wield the most power in the region. And in many ways of analyzing this, this move is more punitive. This move is more about whipping Qatar into shape, in line, getting them in line, and saying that Qatar must recognize Saudi Arabia as the regional hegemon. Now, through that lens, everything actually falls into place. Even though it's to the detriment of our military relationships with regard to our base in Qatar, it is actually consistent with some political goals of the United States that have favored Saudi Arabia for a very long time. For the President of the United States to side with Saudi Arabia, even at the expense of the military base that the United States has in Qatar. So if we view it through the lens of regional hegemony, it makes sense, especially because I believe I was reading in Foreign Policy. I don't know who to credit exactly, but this is clearly not my thought. It's one that I read. The relationship between the United States and Qatar has always existed on two levels, one politically and then the second one militaristically. In other words, our relationship with Qatar in regards to our base has always, our military base there has always transcended our political relationship. And so this, if nothing else, is really just a testing of the strength of that theory, whether or not the United States can maintain in a favorable fashion our military base, which is extremely important to our goals in the region, in light of the President of the United States aligning with Saudi Arabia and 4 other nations, actually 5 other nations, if I'm not mistaken. Today, Jordan signed on with it as well. Whether or not our relationship with Qatar and our militaristic relationship with Qatar can be maintained in a favorable fashion in light of the United States President siding in an economic and diplomatic severance of ties between Qatar and 5 other Middle Eastern nations. There's going to be a lot to discuss with regards to this story as it goes on, because it is ongoing and developing as we speak.